Okay, hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Artist Industry podcast from Kartel Music Group. This is where we explore how the recorded music business actually works for artists, not the music industry machine. If you're watching on our Kartel Music Group YouTube channel, hit subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Today's guest is a true pioneer of modern pop and a champion of the next generation. Producer, songwriter, artist, label owner, and radio producer, presenter, Steve Levine, celebrating 50 years in the business. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'll give a quick background to you, Steve, and an introduction, and then we'll kind of get into it. I know there's heaps we can talk about. So Steve started as a tape op at CBS Studios back in 1975. Rising quickly to in-house engineer and cutting his teeth with trailblazing punk, new wave and pop artists, including The Clash, XTC, the Vibrators and many more. He went on to produce all of the Culture Club's classic hits and the band's 3 multi-platinum albums, iconic records that helped define an era. Along the way, he's picked up a Brit Award, a Grammy, a Music Week Award, and a Sony Award for radio presenting. Recognition across studio, song, and broadcast. Beyond the console, Steve's storytelling chops shine in audio. His company, Magnum Opus Broadcasting, created the BBC's Record Producers series for Radio 2 and 6 Music. And he's collected New York Radio Festival Golds for BBC World Service documentaries, including In the Studio, following Genesis's The Last Domino tour. During the pandemic, he was commissioned to compose You Me, the musical for the World Service with the BBC Philharmonic, written, rehearsed and recorded under lockdown, and it went on to win multiple golds and a rare grand award. Truly impressive under lockdown. I can't imagine what was involved. Steve also runs Baltic Jazz Recordings out of Liverpool, releasing jazz, soul, neo-soul and lo-fi projects with collaborators across the UK scene, whilst his long-standing role at as a Lipper companion sees him mentoring future producers and engineers, co-presenting the Future Producer Prize along with Sir Paul McCartney and Tony Platt. And this brings us to how we met and came to be working together with you, Steve. We're partnering on a brilliant young 5-piece band from Liverpool called Hush Tones, whose excellent debut album drew support from BBC Introducing, Radio 1, 6 Music and Radio X, and they're now releasing album 2 with some help from the team at Kartel. So across the next hour, we'll discuss Steve's journey in music and how the creative process has changed over 50 years. We'll unpack how discoverability has evolved over time and touch on current industry talking points, such as AI and artists questioning their place on streaming platforms. Steve Levine, 50 years in and still pushing. Steve, welcome to Artist Industry.
Thank you, Charles. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, well, it's great to kind of meet in person properly and sort of learn a bit more about your past and all your wonderful experiences. So let's dive in. And if I can ask you to kind of, if we can start by kind of going back to your early days and perhaps just sort of touch on some of those early breakout moments and highlights and what it was like sort of finding your way as a young producer and working with acts who now household names, but at the time weren't yet discovered. So I guess if we go back to kind of mid-70s, late 70s, and how were you getting into studios and working in that environment? What was the entry point?
Well, things have changed so much, and they've changed even in the last few years. I mean, hence a studio like this. Back in the mid-70s, there were lots of commercial studios around, and the record companies themselves had their own recording facilities. It was often just a default situation that all the major record companies had their own studios. So I had always wanted to be a sound engineer from school. That was literally my one job, and I was so focused on that, I almost didn't want to do anything else.
Why? What was the trigger?
There were several triggers growing up. I was surrounded by music at an early age. But I just was fascinated by the sound on records, even from a young age. And so I discovered that's what the job was. It was called a sound engineer. And at school, I stayed on for 1 year of sixth form, so hence being 50 years in the industry. I left at 17. I just did 1 year of sixth form. And then with the careers teacher, we decided it would be best if I just went and tried to get a job, because there was no further opportunities. There, you mentioned Lipper. That didn't exist in those days. Had that existed, I almost certainly would have gone to somewhere like that. But in my day, there weren't those crafted courses that enabled you to teach sound recording techniques. It just didn't exist. The industry itself was at a different place anyway. If you think of the timeline of the 70s, we'd just gone from the kind of 60s, and in my era, we'd gone from 16 track to 24 track. So it was still a new industry in terms of record production and the role of the record producer as we see it today. There were pioneers in the 60s, like Phil Spector, who I absolutely admired. But that's what I wanted to do. So I was fortunate enough to get a job as, in those days, it was T-Boy, going into tape-op, becoming an assistant engineer. Now, CBS had a phenomenal policy, as did many studios in those days, of how do you train people? You can't give them commercial sessions because the clients are paying, in those days, quite a hefty whack per hour. Studio time was expensive in those days. And so the way they did it was to give demo time to bands that they saw that they weren't sure if they wanted to sign. And again, in those days, if you went to a pub and heard a band, very few pubs had great PAs. Most bands didn't have PAs. It was the guitars and the drums were whatever the noise they made on stage, and the mics were the only thing going through a PA. So it's very hard for record executives to decide if that band was any good or even hear the songs. So CBS had a policy of, if their scouts and A&R teams discovered a band, they would give them, free of charge, no strings attached, a day or 2 days in the studio so they could come down and listen. And in those days, Whitfield Street Studios, where CBS was about a 15-minute walk from Soho Square, which is where CBS Records office was. So it was a very short journey. And so they would see these bands. And that's how come myself, Simon Humphrey, and many of the other engineers got to work with all these great bands, because they would be gifted a couple of days of studio time. We'd record the demos. And in the case, for example, of XTC, we did their original demos, but they were not signed by CBS. They, in fact, used those exact demos to go and get their deal with Virgin.
Yes.
The Clash, on the other hand, we'd started recording the first set of sessions. And I do really remember this. The A&R team came down that afternoon, and as history knows, they were signed pretty quickly. I think they realized there was something hot there. And so we went from the demos literally into what became the first album. And Simon and I continued recording with them right up to White Man in Hammersmith Palais. So we did everything that the Clash recorded. The very last track was White Man in Hammersmith Palais. And the journey is really interesting, because by that time I was tape up on those sessions. And then as the production got more involved, we actually split between the two studios. We still did most of it in Studio 3, but Studio 2 had a really good piano. And so those that have got eagle ears, listen to White Man in Hammersmith Palais. There's piano on there, and a few other overdubs. And those were done in the other studio. So at that point in time, Simon was upstairs with Joe doing guitar overdubs on another track, and I was downstairs with Mick doing the piano.
Yeah.
And
amazing.
Yeah, which was great.
Yeah.
So I'd kind of transitioned then to a proper assistant engineer.
Right.
And then,
as sort of history in the making with bands that we're so familiar with now, but at the time they were just happening. And so your apprenticeship, if you like, at studios was also putting you in the mix of A&R, of scouting, of building relationships with these artists, and in their very early stages, and being part of that informative process.
And we're roughly the same age. I mean, Mick is a little bit older than me, but we were all on that journey of discovery ourselves. And in fact, I used to live in Hampstead at the time, and Mick lived near Camden Town, so I used to take him home.
Yeah.
You know, we'd finish the sessions, I'd drive him home and drop him off. So we're still friends to this day. It's fantastic. And also, what was interesting with that particular band is there was a transition. Those that know the Clash history, Terry Chimes was the drummer on the original sessions, but then later Topper Headon became the drummer in the Clash. And so there was a big change in the way that the recording process took place. Topper is an incredible musician as well.
Yeah.
And so that changed. And interesting with Topper is I'd worked with Topper outside of the Clash, because Topper was quite a successful session drummer in the London circuit. And I'd worked with another producer who was an A&R executive at CBS Records, who had his own production company. And we used to work at this little studio behind, it was really weird. It was off Park Lane. It was behind what was then the Playboy Bunny Club. There was this tiny little 8-track studio. And I remember doing sessions with this producer, Nicky, and Topper played drums on some of those sessions, you know. So it's an interesting world. You mentioned the Vibrators. That was a band that were fully formed and signed. So we never did the demos with those bands. We just recorded the album.
Yeah.
Same with a punk band called the Drones. Again, they were fully formed. We just went in and recorded the album with them. And so after a while, we kind of got the reputation of working on that kind of music.
Right.
Hence Simon then going on to work with the Jags and working on their records. So it's an interesting thing how you learn your craft as you kind of develop your techniques.
And you're, as a producer and an engineer, you're kind of riding on the wave of what's happening musically, culturally.
Very much so.
The second half of the 70s, obviously punk kind of, really exploding and changing, the musical landscape. And then we sort of head into the 80s and things, so things are always changing, obviously, in sort of music culture, which is the exciting part. But I think from a studio perspective, you're right in the nucleus of that change and the uncertainty of it. What should it sound like? And how do we navigate
And
this?
so many changes were happening. So the demos that we started with were 16-track because CBS was quite late in transitioning from 16 to 24-track, and in fact was beginning to lose business because it hadn't gone to 24-track. But it then made a giant leap, not only going to 24-track, but also changing to MCI equipment, and that was pivotal. MCI equipment was very popular in America, had become the new thing for many, many reasons. You had 24 tracks of recording, the tape machine had a locator, and the audio quality was incredible. So a load of American artists started working on those consoles. So CBS, being an American company, needed to upgrade to that level. And as a result, then attracted those American producers, which I then got to work with as now an assistant engineer. So that was fantastic for me to learn American production techniques. And that was really different at the time. I think it's worth looking at the timeline of what was happening in the UK versus what was happening in America. In America, you had, I'll just use, Fleetwood Mac as an example, but you had that huge American sound, which was a really well recorded. The Eagles, all that kind of stuff, that American sound. Although the Eagles is somewhat ironic because a lot of that was actually recorded in England. But the sound of that American rock was the sound of FM radio, if you like. That was precision recording. And that was very different to punk, which was very DIY. And I think, as you mentioned, as we transitioned towards the 80s, those two things became part of it because the 80s sonically were fantastic and those records still sound incredible today. But it had a bit of DIY as well. And also synthesizers were starting to really come to the fore, along with the beginnings of sampling technology. So
drum machines.
You had this strange amalgam of all this technology and a load of excitement from a creativity point of view, lots of different songwriting, because those instruments make you write in a different way. They get a different set of creative juices going. It's very different to sitting down with a guitar.
Totally. Well, and thinking about the geography of it, London as a musical creative hub, you can, I think, use the term sort of melting pot in terms of the influences and cultures and different sort of sounds and genres that were coming together. And in the 80s, also the technological developments were becoming part of that, which it is a good segue perhaps to Culture Club and sort of how they entered as something, quite unique.
But I think what you've hit on is correct. Each generation used the technology that they had at their disposal. Everyone knows the Beatles recorded Sgt. Pepper on 4-track.
Yes.
And each generation does make the most of what they have available. And it just happened that as I was becoming a record producer, there was another shift in technology. And we absolutely used that technology. And the very reason that my first conversations happened with John Moss from Culture Club was because of technology. So John came to see me with a quandary.
Right.
He'd heard the work I had done with the Angelic Upstarts, who were a band that were late in the day of punk, but wanted to change their sound to the, I guess, using the example of bands like Joy Division and Orchestral Maneuvers. These were bands that were traditionally guitar bands, but then wanted to include drum machines and synthesizers in their sound.
So sort of the new wave.
Correct.
Beginning.
This was just before what became the New Romantics, if you like. There was like punk, new wave, and then New Romantics, if you want to sort of put them in a line. One of the things that John had just come out of was a combination of playing in Adam and the Ants, which is 2 drummers, and his love of these new beats that were emerging from the African continent, Burundi beat particularly. It was very popularized on, say, Bow Wow Wow, that it's an African beat that's quite infectious. So one of John's very first questions to me was, how could we incorporate some of that sound in Culture Club but not have 2 drummers? So I said to John, look, I've just bought a Lindrum, which at the time was unbelievably expensive. And I said, look, we could program the beat, the backbeat, and you could play on top of it. Now, also, that time, the very late 70s, early 80s, as the drum machine was becoming a real force in production, the shift had changed as well. What was traditionally disco music from, say, I don't know, the Shalimar Whispers sound of Earth, Wind and Fire, that 70s disco was morphing into this new sound of disco, the club scene. And I'd been to some of those clubs and they were phenomenal. Sound systems had improved enormously. And so this demand for this kind of...
The kick drum,
the extended 12-inch mix. So that was what we incorporated in the early part of Culture Club, because George had come from the club scene and knew that really, really well. And we wanted to create... There were so many bands around at that time that were making music like that. Beggar and Co., Spano Ballet, this big 12-inch sound, which was big sections with just the kick drum, then bongos, percussion, bass, lots of sequences. I think probably we all owe a huge debt to Giorgio Moroder with this, and probably I Feel Love was probably the thing that was like the line in the sand. I remember first hearing that and thinking, oh my God, this is like a change. This is a real change, even though that was the late 70s. But that probably was the thing that, if you like, you always, things throw, someone starts the ball rolling, and that I absolutely believe is the track that started that moving. I think many people would agree with you. Not least Daft Punk, who I worked on when I was at Virgin. Right.
They obviously encapsulated that Giorgio Moroder sound.
And I think that Blue Monday was like the kind of we mentioned earlier about how those Joy Division morphed into that, but how that sound absolutely captured the moment. And we were trying to do it, of course, with White Boy Dance. We didn't quite get there, but it certainly was very popular in the clubs, but it wasn't a hit.
No, but I guess Boy George was there, at the beginning of it, in the heartbeat of it, and sort of the consideration of how we bring this into their music, and their music had sort of other dimensions. That it wasn't disco, it wasn't necessarily straight up club music, it was pop music, roots music as well.
And I think the other thing that happened with Culture Club, we're all approximately the same age, a couple of years between all of us. We grew up with glam rock, including Slade, David Bowie, all of those. We also grew up with, again, if you look at I love looking at timelines when you look at what was actually happening in the charts. Reggae was really, really becoming so big. I grew up with a lot of reggae. So that was a parallel. And disco. Those were all happening at the same time. And, of course, we mentioned the sort of Americana rock. Those were all late 70s bubbling away. The charts had a huge mix in those days. Those influences, plus our love of soul and Motown and Philadelphia, all became this melting pot. Hence, Culture Club is the perfect name. It was a melting pot of all these ideas that became our ideas in the tracks.
Absolutely, yeah. And truly, era-defining music. I think it's easy to say a statement like that, but the more you think about Culture Club and listen to some of those early records, they really did bring together, in quite a uniquely British way, I think, all of those things, that sort of fusion.
Some of them are timestamps of the era, depending on what equipment we use. But then there's others. I think Do You Really Want to Hurt Me has the unique sound that many reggae records have, where you can't quite place what year it is. And also, again, talking of the charts, unusually, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me replaced Pass the Dutchie as a number one. That's the only time, as far as I'm aware, that 2 reggae songs have been number one and flipped.
Oh, interesting.
That's how important reggae was becoming. And we love Lovers Rock, and we love all those great interpretations of phenomenal reggae records. And so, yeah, reggae is an unusual genre. You can listen to something from the Trojan catalogue today, and you can't quite place often the time of when it was.
Yeah, timeless.
Reggae is somewhat timeless, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And then there's other tracks of culture, like, of course, Karma Chameleon, which is absolutely the sound of 1983.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and quite a unique sound.
And gets synced for that very reason.
Yes.
I heard it on something very recently on a television program.
Yeah.
If you want to kind of time travel, you put that track on, everyone knows what. Yeah.
And we touched on a little bit how they broke Culture Club and came out. And I just want to reference this in terms of how things have changed a little bit in terms of being discovered as an artist. So you touched on sort of, the clubs and they had songs that were, club hits, as it were, but didn't quite cross out. But how important were, clubs and music kind of permeating that scene? This is obviously an era where there's certainly no internet, long before. So in terms of word of mouth and people getting excited about whether that's the industry or consumers just building a buzz.
So what was interesting before the internet was that bands had a sound that operated almost like a silo. So Culture Club absolutely were the London sound. And it was very interesting because they played a gig, Roy's from Essex, and they played a gig in Essex early on. And Depeche Mode were from Essex. But until that point, we'd not heard their sound, and that's not that far away. I had also worked with China Crisis, who are from Liverpool, and I'd worked with The Mood, who were sort of York-based, Leeds, York. The sound that they were making was different to the sound that China Crisis were making, which was different to the sound. And what I tried to do actually early on is some of the musicians I used played on some of those tracks because I was trying to glue that together. Of course, today with the internet, if a band has a unique sound, everyone can analyze the sound, find out so much about it. But in those days, everything did operate very, very separately, which was a good thing because it meant that the charts were very unique. The sound of Duran Duran is not the sound of Culture Club, not the sound of Human League. They were all really, really different. Even though we had some of the same equipment, we operated it very differently. Whereas today, perhaps a negative is there's a bit more morphing of stuff.
A bit more uniformity.
Yes. But there's always an original idea. I love the fact that the same piece of equipment, let's take a synthesizer, can be given to 5 different people and they will come up with 5 different results. And that's so encouraging. And that happens today.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So Culture Club, things were happening in the club scene.
Yeah.
But there's a breakout moment just in terms of different times where they got onto Top of the Pops.
Yes.
And that, if you think about sort of the visual aspect and the sort of, the influences that kind of, that must have been a moment where they kind of, reached a much broader audience. And until that time, until television, they couldn't do that.
Well, the George that we knew was in fact the George of Top of the Pops. George dressed like that all the time. That wasn't a stage persona. That was how George was. And in fact, when I first met John Moss, he showed me a recent photo session that George had done. And so George, with the original outfits which Sue Clones devised, were very much the wardrobe. And in fact, Sue gave us some T-shirts. So I had some of those T-shirts. I wish I still had them now, which we wore in the studio. So it was a kind of, as people would have a branded something now, it was that. It became a bit of a uniform, and certainly the fans had that. So I was absolutely thinking, wow, we've got all these kind of outfits. What if the world saw that? And the only way for the world to see it at that point was Top of the Pops.
Yeah.
We need to get on Top of the Pops. How are we going to get on Top of the Pops? And then it was an incredible lucky moment that there's 2 stories that populate the world. One is that Shaking Stevens was ill and therefore couldn't do Top of the Pops. And the other story, which I believe is the correct story, is that Michael Hurl, the producer, had that particular week a moratorium on videos. Because those that know old Top of the Pops, thankfully, they're all being shown on BBC4. Sometimes, depending on availability, they would show a video. And often they would have a full live complement of acts. This particular show, they wanted to have a full complement of acts rather than videos. And Elton John was the next highest climber with Blue Eyes. And he had that famous video of him playing piano on a cliff or a mountaintop.
Yes.
And for some reason, that wasn't selected. And so the next highest entry in the chart, and the chart came out on a Tuesday, the next highest entry was us at 32, I think it was. So we were just outside the top 30. And so we get the call to go on Top of the Pops. Now, in those days, 99% of Top of the Pops was mimed and lip-synced to the record. But there was this terrible rule that the Musicians Union had that lasted for quite some time after Culture Club. It lasted, I think, by the time I was doing the Honeys, that had finished. But it essentially meant that every band that was on Top of the Pops had to go through this facade of re-recording their song. Now, I had the experience of when I was at CBS Studios, I recorded Top of the Pops tracks with Mud, Hot Chocolate.
So a TV version.
You had to re-record it because the story goes, it goes right back to The Love Affair. The Love Affair's famous, I don't know, depending on the age of this audience, The Love Affair had a huge, huge hit with Everlasting Love.
Yes.
But it was all session players. And the Musicians Union took umbrage to the fact that when a band appeared on Top of the Pops and mimed to the record, as was happening in those days, they didn't get a fee.
Yes.
So instead of just giving them a fee, which is what happens now, the Musicians Union went through this thing of saying, well, they had to re-record the song. Now, a song would have taken, in some cases, weeks and months to record, and you had 3 hours to do it. Now, I'd been a witness to this charade for many, many years. Sometimes the tracks were used. Famously, when I did the Sexy Thing version of Hot Chocolate with Mickey Most producing, the Top of the Pops version is the one that we re-recorded because Mickey loved the way that it was very close to the record, but not exactly the record.
Yeah.
And so that one, I know we definitely didn't swap the tapes, as it was called. But on many others, I remember doing a couple with Mud, the last Mud singles, and we swapped the tapes because
For the studio recording.
So what happens was you went through the process of recording it, and then the guy would come down from the BBC and the MU, and you just kind of, luckily CBS Studios had a pub next door, so you take them for a drink, and they say, we'll mix the record, you go and have a drink, and then we'd kind of put the master in a new reel of tape, label it all up and go, there you go.
There you go.
So I was aware of that. So I absolutely said to Culture Club, and to my other bands I was working with at the time, there's no way we're going to use our re-recordings because they're just not going to be as good. I'm going to swap the tapes every single time, and I know how to do it.
Yeah.
So I said to George, here's what I think we can do. Because George obviously, you know, they all wanted to come to the studio to meet George. So I said, pull a fast one. Say you've got like a funny voice, you need to go in the studio and turn the lights down and everything. So we did it so that actually what happened was they were miming in the studio to the record, and George had the lights really low so you couldn't see his lips moving. So yeah, the first version of Do You Really Want to Hurt Me that's on Top of the Pops is my actual record.
It's the studio.
And I managed to have every single one correct, even though there was more analyzing and we had more people come to the studio. We did all sorts of tricks to do it. The one we did, which I'm so proud of, was that on one particular occasion we were really being examined intently well, but I just started using the Fairlight and they didn't really know what the Fairlight did, so I locked the Fairlight up to the multi-track and said, look, I press play here and all this music comes out. And they went, oh, it's so impressive. Now, you can do that today, but in 1983, you couldn't do that. No. But I pretended you could. And we even swapped all the lights on the tape machine from red to green so that it looked like we were recording.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's what the charade was. But once they got on Top of the Pops, I had a very strong feeling that if the world could hear that song and see George, it would really work. And it did, because as you know, the record went bam up the charts and within a few weeks was number one.
Yeah. And that's a real watershed moment.
Absolutely.
For culture and obviously for Culture Club.
And my career.
And your career.
My career changed overnight at that point.
Yeah.
You know.
So you have, you know, a true global hit ultimately with an artist, you know, and obviously Karma Chameleon comes quite shortly after that as well. So another stratospheric hit single. And I mean, we'll come back to just the mind-blowing differences in, you know, what artists need to do to promote their music that you've just described and how it is today. So much to unpack within that. But for you as a producer at that point, we touched on this talking previously, you know, your career changes and the perception, you know, and it's true, I think, when an artist has a single or a producer is sort of instrumental in a hit, then you're on the map, so to speak. And just interested, in your reflections on that and the sort of the pros and the cons in terms of what happened next. Obviously, Culture Club continued to have a fantastic career, particularly in the 80s. But as for you as a producer,
well, I ended up with a lot of work before Karma Chameleon. There was a block of time when I was working on many acts. So I had Jimmy the Hoover, Tantalize is the one hit we had. That's the one and only hit, but that was a really lovely record. David Grant had several top, I think maybe 2 or 3 was the highest we got. We didn't have a number 1, but we certainly had top 5 of a few of his tracks. In fact, there was one famous Top of the Pops episode, which I do remember, as we've discussed Top of the Pops, where I did have all the acts on there apart from one. So we had Jimmy the Hoover, David Grant, Culture Club, and I had another band called the UK Players. So there was that was quite fun. But I was very busy for a short time. Then after the massive success, then you have that strange period where people think you're so busy and so expensive that you have a window where you don't have any work, which is and I've spoken to many producer friends who've gone through the same kind of cycle or the same arc. And it's a very strange way the business perceives you. It's changed now, of course, but back then it was a perception. Get me that guy that just did that record, you know, because that's kind of what they did. Yeah. They were just looking at numbers. And if you had a number 1 record, they go, get me that guy, you know.
Yeah.
And that's why it's very interesting between the UK and America, because America tended to go, just get me that guy, whatever the price, because they were looking at the numbers in Billboard. Whereas in the UK, they were still always penny pinching.
And are you working predominantly in studios still at this point owned by record companies? So you're brought on as a producer, but you're not in your own studio. You're working in a recording company studio facility.
By that time, by the Culture Club period, I was working in independent commercial studios, not my own studios, independent commercial studios. So, for example, with Culture Club, the majority was done at Red Bus Studios. We did do some at CBS Studios. In fact, on the Victims and Time, the orchestra parts were done at CBS Studios because we needed a really big studio for the orchestra parts. Some of the first Culture Club album was not done at Red Bus because we didn't have the budget and we were at very small studios. We used to work at some really shitty studios to try and get the tracks done. But Do You Really Want to Hurt Me actually was recorded. That was one of the first recordings at Red Bus because we managed to get time there to record that. But many of the album tracks on the first album were not actually started at Red Bus. They were started at all sorts of strange little studios. But once we had some budget, then... So the thing about that is if you work at cheaper studios in those days, although the budget was tight and the time or the rate was less, you ended up taking twice as long because so much didn't work. When you work at a more expensive studio, and I argued my point very precisely with the companies then, I said, I need to work at a proper studio because actually I can do the job much more quickly. So even though the hourly rate may be twice what you think it is, I'm doing it in a shorter period of time. And that resonated with them. And that's absolutely true. And that's true to this day. If you work in a professional studio with professional people, it may be more expensive per hour,
but it's well maintained.
You spend less hours and things work first go. You're not spending ages trying to find a cable that works or a mic that works, which is often what happens in a less professional studio.
And with some of the, if you think about sort of synthesizers and drum machines that were sort of coming through in that era, as a producer, are you investing in some of those and bringing some of those toys with you?
Absolutely.
Because
that's true of myself and many of my contemporary producers. The record companies didn't care.
No.
So they're the tools of my trade. As a what's the best word? As a lover of great sonic beauty, wanted to invest in these synthesizers. So initially, when I was working with the Angelic Upstarts, I had the Lindrum machine and my Korg synthesizer. So those are my first 2 things. Very soon after that, I bought a few more synthesizers. Synthesizers were expensive, but they were about to become more expensive. So the first synths were actually reasonable. They weren't outrageous. But then what happened was as we moved towards the 80s, the synthesizers became incredibly powerful and also quite expensive. And the Fairlight, particularly the sampling, that was, as people used to say, it was the price of a house. The Fairlight was £35,000 in 1981. That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
The Lindrum was $3,500 in 1981. That was also a lot of money. But some of the other synthesizers were not expensive. In fact, ironically, you could buy a Mini Moog in that period for a lot less than you pay for one now, because they've become very collectible and
Yes.
people didn't want them. There was like this window where some analog synths were really cheap because no one wanted them. And I've spoken to friends of mine who are now collectors, and some fortunately hung on to them and some didn't. But I kept changing mine as I wanted different ways of working, and I found them very inspirational. So many of my records are a result of being inspired by the sonic palette that I had. And I think that is, I'm not a guitarist. So for me, having these keyboard sounds and the different effects that you can use with them became very inspiring. And I could then say to the artists I'm working with, because very often the job of the producer is as an interpreter. They say, I love that record and I like that sound on that record. What is that? And I can go, I reckon it's this. Or they say, I really love the mood of this record. How did they achieve that? And I said, well, I think it's this. And so I would often sonically interpret their thoughts and say, well, what about these ideas? What about this sound? And they go, oh, that's good. And then, of course, under their control, it's something different. And also to take the burden away from them, because even then the manuals were, like that. And very few artists have got the patience to read a manual, whereas I would read the manual.
You would read the manual. You're a manual reader.
And I'd understand them, yes. As I often say, it's very often the case is read the manual. But if you read the manual, then you did understand some of the quirks. And so very often I'd be the kind of fast track. They would say, well, I want this. And I go, bang.
Get it going.
Yeah. Not wasting the time.
And you're really, part of the band at that point, essentially. You're actually bringing texture and sound and bringing things together. So, so the technology part's super interesting. The recording part is also part of that journey, and the more traditional part, I suppose, how you record a drum sound or a vocal sound. And I think one of the things that happened after Culture Club was you working with the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
And that perhaps points more to how you are perceived as a great vocal producer and working with vocals.
Well, that happened because during my tenure as assistant engineer, MCI equipment was installed in Studio 2, and many, many American producers loved MCI equipment, but it worked very differently to the Neve equipment that the studio had already had. And the biggest fundamental difference was that each channel could be both a microphone or a line and a monitor. And for older engineers, that concept was maybe a little alien, whereas to me, having not grown up traditionally with that method, it was easy for me to learn a different way of working. So I was.
And this is the console.
The console.
This is how the channels in the console work.
So number one, for example, on a Neve, essentially, you had 1 to 28 on the left-hand side. Those were your microphones. And on the right-hand side, you had 1 to 16. Those were the playback of the tracks. It's fairly obvious what's going on.
Yeah.
A, B, C. So if you wanted something turned up after it was recorded, it was the right-hand side of the desk. If you wanted the microphone levels turned up, it was the left-hand side of the desk. And if somebody wanted echo or a delay, each channel had a send and you'd send it. Very, very simple.
Yeah.
With the MCI, first of all, it had 42 channels, which could be all microphones, and they had a little fader above it, which could be the monitor. Now, you could have channel 1 being microphone 1 and track playback 1 if you wanted to, but it was very, very flexible the way that it could work. So a simple way of running the desk would be 1 to 24 little faders could be the monitors when you were recorded, and all the big faders could be your microphones. But they had this button called a flip, and you could flip it round. So it's what everyone uses today, but in those days, that was a new concept, to be able to flip the desk around and have it how you wanted it. So you could have the whole desk on big faders, or all on little faders, or a mix, however you wanted to work. It was incredibly flexible in terms of the way records were beginning to be produced. So in the case of my working with Bruce Johnson, we worked with the group Sailor, which was a combination of acoustic instruments, so an acoustic drum kit, which took up maybe 16 to 18 channels, then a ton of synthesizers, which then went into the same channels, but with line levels, 2600 millimeter, all those. But then they had George Kaianos, the guitarist, played an acoustic guitar, but it was not mic'd up. We used to take a direct signal from that. So this was a really hybrid sonic palette. And their vocals, which were recorded with a normal microphone like this and multi-layered. And I knew my way around the desk really well. Bruce was very impressed with my kind of dexterity of changing stuff around, and very often would say to me, because I'd also grown up with those synthesizers in their infancy. Studios would often rent that stuff, and very often producers would. There was one particular producer who used to rent stuff for a session in Studio 3, and it would be left there all weekend because the rental company wouldn't come and pick it up until the Monday.
Right.
So if he rented it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it would be there Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they pick it up Monday. So I'd go in and just
Practice.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the best way of learning.
Yeah. Get your
so
10,000 hours.
I got very swift with some of those synths. So Bruce would say to me, "Oh, Steve, can you get me a string sound or whatever sound?" You know, and then that's how it worked.
Yeah.
So Bruce said to me, "Come to America, work with me in Los Angeles." Those that know the Beach Boys timeline will know that Bruce at that period of time was the most successful producer within the Beach Boys, because Brian wasn't really doing any work. The Beach Boys themselves, having just had the LA album, the Light album release, which was quite successful, there was a hiatus, and Bruce was very successful. So I went to Los Angeles, worked with Bruce on loads of different projects, jingles, records, all sorts of things. And that was.
Did you move there? Or
No, I
you
just went
visited.
there. Yeah, I mean, it's different then. I didn't have a visa or anything.
Yeah.
I just got on a plane. I went on Laker Airways, which then those days was like 99 quid. Turned up they met me at Los Angeles airport, and I worked for, you know, I can't even remember how long it was. You know, I remember having the first day I got a bike and went across the Santa Monica. And I got so sunburnt because, of course, it was like so hot.
Yeah.
And I'd not really experienced that. That was my first time going to California as well. And the California sun is quite. Thankfully, I do tan, but it was, my God, that was quite a, because it didn't look like a sunny day. It was just an overcast day, but you can still get burnt anyway. We worked at some really great studios who had really different equipment. It was my first experience of working with an API desk, which was the sort of American equivalent of a Neve. I even got to work on a very rare machine, which this company called Stevens made, which was a 32-track machine. It was incredible. But I had all this sort of knowledge. This was, so I started working with Bruce in 77, 78, so around 79, and then I came back to the UK full of ideas, and he said, "You need to be a producer." And so that's really what changed my role. I wanted to be more of a producer than an engineer. But still having the engineering skill, because in those days, you know, producers came from two backgrounds. You were either a sonic engineering background or a musical arranging background.
Yes.
And they were not necessarily the same. No. Many producers hired arrangers in those days to come in and just do the arrangements. I did. You know, the strings were arranged on the Culture Club records with an arranger. It was very common for that to happen.
Yes.
I'd also worked on classical recordings as an engineer, and they had multiple arrangers and editors. There was, you know, a team on those things. So it wasn't unusual to not have a musical background, as it were. Yeah. And mine was just self-taught. I mean, like the bands were. So I guess I had that in common with the bands. We were very few bands in those days had, you know, classical training or had been to college. Most of them just picked it up as they went along.
A lot of innovation.
Yeah.
And at a time of, certainly technologically within the studio, a lot of quite rapid change and development.
Yeah.
So,
and I think the learning of these instruments creates a sound as well, because if you don't know exactly what you're doing with it, sometimes the happy accidents, and they play such a role. They really do.
But there's a balance there, something you said to me earlier about sort of being the swan in a session where no one can see how frantically you're paddling underneath to make sure nothing is going wrong as that important take happens, and you don't want to miss it, obviously.
It's so important because the band's management and the label, they don't care about that stuff. They just want stuff to happen as quickly as possible.
It needs to work.
Yeah, I have a client that I still work with today. I worked with him this week. I've worked with him for 50 years. That's exactly what he expects. He comes in, this is what he wants, and he wants to leave with it. And he doesn't want just smooth.
So the journey from being an engineer and really learning your craft, and even sort of, if we go back, sort of coming out of school and really having that time, I suppose, where you were able to develop these skills and understanding, so it was second nature. That foundation to becoming a producer gives you the ability to know how to operate things and know what you can create.
And I think, you know, I've used this analogy before. I don't have perfect pitch at all, but I have the equivalent sonic perfect pitch, as in, and this happened from quite a young age, I can listen to a record and I can, in my mind, think, it was probably that, and that, and that. You know, I can distill the ingredients. I listen to a record. Maybe a film director does the same. They look at a film and they can see the cuts, they can see the ADR, they can see where it is. I listen to a record and I can still hear the joins.
You can hear the channels.
Yeah, and I can think, and so it's very helpful with bands. Even very recently with the Hush Tones on the new record, Mick played me something. He said, I'd really like this particular guitar sound on a record. And we'd already recorded the guitar. And I said, why don't you say that at the beginning? He said, but I didn't think of it then. He said, I've just been listening to the mix. He said, so we nearly finished the record, the particular track. And he said, but I think I can hear this sound. I really like it. And I said, well, I know what that is. Thankfully, I have a piece of equipment that can do it. And I said, well, let me try it. And I went, oh, it's perfect. And that is now part of the mix on that track. It was essentially a faux 12-string sound. And the record, because he thought it was actually played on a 12-string guitar. And I said, no, that's not a 12-string guitar. That's a 6-string guitar, but with a 12-string
with a pedal
effect.
Or something. Yeah.
It was actually the branding here, the Eventide H3000, which I still have in my rack. And I said, that's the sound, because I could hear it doing it.
So you put the same recording through that device.
Our recording.
Your recording,
yes.
and we're able to create the
Correct.
sound. Yeah.
And just added 2 more channels on the mix, and it sounded really great, you know. And then there's some things that you leave to the 11th hour that I use modern things on. There's one of the tracks where we were really happy with what we recorded, but as I was mixing, one part of the guitar solo just didn't punch. I couldn't get it any louder to hear it. And I was just doing some development work for a plugin manufacturer. They'd given me a pre-release version of a plugin to do some presets, and I said to Mick, let me just try it on this. And that was it. It just popped out, and we went, and I saved the setting, and it's available now as a setting. But it was just one of those things. That was where I didn't really know whether it would work, but I just thought, let me just try it, because I'm searching for something now that just will pull the sound out of the mix. So sometimes it's absolutely down to that. And then sometimes, a couple of days ago, we've just recorded an acoustic session of some of the tracks. 99.9% of the sound was recorded as it will be on the mix.
Right.
Cut live vocals, live everything. But I made sure that the sounds were as I wanted them.
Yeah.
So that's captured almost like a photo, click, you know.
So that's the art of recording it well. So the room sounds great, the instruments sound great. That's where you're focusing.
Yes, although I did make a facetious comment, because Mick came back in to listen to it, and he did say, sounds really good, doesn't it? And I said, yeah, it does. I said, do you think I should do this professionally? And he kind of laughed. But it really did.
You could probably say that 50 years in, I think, and
but
get away with it.
Honestly, we had a very lucky break with the way that it sounded, and you'll hear this on the tracks. I put up some room mics, and my room's, fairly big, but I predominantly wanted to capture the sound because we were filming it as well. And when I stood where the camera was, I thought, it sounds nice here. Let me put 2 mics up here where I'm hearing it with my ears. But everything was multi-mic'd. Because Martha that was kind of directly in front of the mic, but maybe, I don't know, 20 feet away, 30 feet away. When we were listening back to the first pass, we went, wow, that sounds really good, because it had created this depth to her voice that I hadn't actually appreciated until we listened back to it, because I didn't have the room mics very loud. But that's a happy accident where it's actually added, the spill has added, not taken away.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this is, I think, a really interesting point to kind of bring in, you in the room as a producer, but in the room with Hush Tones, you're also the record label. You're also thinking about that. And there are lots of different types of producers, as we've kind of touched around in the conversation. Same can be true, said, of record labels. They come from different vantage points and offer, certainly today, many different types of things. But perhaps, unlike when you first started, most record labels now don't have studios. They're not coming from that sort of physical recording background. And I think it's really interesting that you also have a record label, or a couple of record labels actually, and you can be in the room making the record and informing as a producer the way that it's going to sound. And that obviously ends up as a product, and you're kind of seeing it through. And I think for many artists, and certainly many that we work with, as a sort of label services provider, that's missing. That you could call it A&R, you can call it the music producer, or the role of the record label to help produce the record into something And I just wonder how you, because you've experienced a number of decades, and
Yeah.
how the recording industry has evolved.
Well, it started as a default position because what happened was I had worked with a band a few years ago, which is why we started the label. And this was in the last, well, I'll say the band so that it may, so it's a band called 6 Day Riot. And I'm still very friendly with Tamara to this day, but we made a great record and we started getting some airplay. And on Radio 2 and Six Music didn't exist then, but it was Radio 2. We started to get some airplay.
And you were releasing it for them?
Well, no.
No,
We,
okay.
so we were trying to get a deal.
Yeah.
Right. This was the thing. So how it actually came to me was there's a famous plugger called Jeff Chegwin, who is still with us and is still a very good plugger. And he said, I found this band. They've sent some demos in and they're not very good quality, but I think you'd love the music. So I met with Tamara and Soren, the two main part of the band. And so we decided to start recording. And then what actually happened was a series of really unfortunate events where we had some interest from some labels. And this was the last, the streaming services hadn't yet been invented.
So noughties?
But the internet had.
Yeah. Okay.
And, Napster and all, it was all kind of starting to,
A difficult time.
a very difficult time. So we essentially had loads of meetings, loads of record companies, and it was all proving to be a complete waste of time. And it was in the end, Tamara said to me, why don't we just release it ourselves? And I went, you know what? It's not that hard anymore. Let's just do that. So that's actually what we did.
Right.
And we started to get some traction with it. As it turned out, we did the classic thing. We pressed up, this was still CDs, I still remember it. We pressed up, I'm going to say 2,000 CDs, and we sold them instantly. So we said, well, let's do another load. So we did another 3,000, of which I've still probably got 1,000 left, But that's what happened in those days.
Yeah.
It was just that last physical world.
Yeah.
But it taught me a great lesson of exactly what you've just described. If you're starting, and then the very next project I did was a hybrid between the television world and the record world. I was working with a band, and then they were invited to be part of Hollyoaks to be in part of that. So we supplied the music for that, but they were a real band. And then it just kind of went to each stage more so and more so. And then I did a band called Patch William, who actually came to me through my daughter because the drummer was at university with her, recorded an album with her. We did actually get nominated for an Ivor with them. Same problem of moving to the next level is very, very, very difficult, which is why we've partnered with you for the Hush Tones. We need the additional support and help. It's impossible without it. So the relationship with you is brand new, but that's the very reason. How can we take it to the next stage?
Well, that's it, and that's the challenge. And as we know, there's lots of different ways that it can happen. Traditional ways such as radio, social media, and there's a lot of I think pressure on the artists these days to provide the platform, to provide the reach, and that does put a lot of work into content creation, different versions. You mentioned the acoustic versions you're recording. So, I mean it takes you back to sort of Culture Club and the discoverability. What it was like for them, having or being able to identify the ingredients behind an artist, and they're going to be different for every artist. But what is it about this band that we can connect to people with culturally, musically, a combination of those things? And I think it's a bit of a journey, and sometimes a bit of luck along the way. Sometimes it's, the people involved and the timing can
yes,
kind of
I think the Hush
create...
Tones need some luck now.
Yes.
Because I think they've been unlucky. They were unlucky first time with COVID, but then that became a strength because it forced us to change the way that we went about things. They've been unfortunate with those sliding doors moments where we've been incredibly close and then just at the last minute something has happened. The music, I think, is lovely. They're a lovely bunch of people. They sing incredibly well, and anyone that wants to listen to the acoustic versions, those are cut live.
Yeah.
No
Amazing.
studio tricks. That's how good they are.
Yeah.
And anyone that's seen them live are blown away by them, because to have 4 people, it's a 5-piece band, 4 of whom sing, and we have 2 male and 2 female vocals. as a producer, that's a beautiful tone palette to work with. And their range is lovely as well. You know, the various ranges that they can do within that block. Those harmonies are fantastic, and I love those harmonies.
Well, and that's, you know, that probably is the nucleus that we need to focus on in terms of the marketing and driving and creating their point of difference out there. So, yeah, it's an exciting moment, obviously, there.
And although they're influenced by a lot of those harmony bands like the Beach Boys or Fleetwood Mac, as many bands are, I think the composite sound that they create is not specifically that, which I love. I mean, that's the thing I find with harmonies. Harmonies can be the trademark of a band. If you think of the Bee Gees, you think of the Beach Boys, you think of even Queen. You know, when you hear those harmony blocks, those become the trademark sound. I'm hoping that if people listen enough to the Hush Tones, they'll go, that's their tone.
That's their sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna touch on a couple of quick things here. We're coming towards the end, but so just, I guess, coming off that very human point of creativity, harmonies. What do you think creatively? And it's we could probably talk for an hour about this, about where AI sits in the creative process. How do you feel about that from a music making perspective, from a creativity perspective?
I think when it's used with full consent of the artist and it's used as a tool, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I use it myself in my production on several levels. So, for example, I have a client that had only a mono version of a track that he recorded a number of years ago. That's all he has. Thankfully, the tape is in good condition. I was able to transfer that tape to my system, and then using AI, I was able to separate out some of the elements of the mono recording and make a stereo recording with enhancements. It sounded absolutely fantastic. So I was able to restore and rescue something. And also, it's a historically important recording of, I won't say who's on it, but it is very important who's on it. It's somebody's very early recording, and it's luckily the tape was in great condition. That's one advantage. I had something recently with one of my radio shows where, unfortunately, due to the weather, we had a studio booked, and that person couldn't get to the studio. There's an American, and had to do the interview on their phone, and the recording quality of the phone was not the same as these type of microphones. And again, with AI, it's able to work out where the noise is, get rid of the noise, and clean up the audio. Again, absolutely fantastic. In the same way that photographers use AI to get rid of certain things. So that's really good. In terms of impersonation and passing off, there's two parts to that. There's the fraudulent passing off, which absolutely has to be stopped, and the AI companies that are harvesting data from copyrighted material and not compensating the creators. That's absolutely not acceptable on any level whatsoever. If you wish to use somebody's recording in a film or television program today, you have to apply and get a sync license, and that's not necessarily guaranteed. In most cases it is, and then it's willing buyer, willing seller, a fee is paid, everyone's happy. The same should happen with harvesting the data. Not that they shouldn't be allowed to do it, but they should do it with a fee and provenance, so that if use me as an example, one of my songs is harvested and they particularly like the drum sound on the drum pattern, it's credited. Because funnily enough, I still get a very, very tiny royalty from some of my original sampling library, where I had a sampling CD out in the period of when it was the only way you could get access to these great quality samples.
So 90s, probably?
Yeah. And I put on the sleeve, you've bought this CD, please don't copy the CD and give it to your friends, but if you use it yourself, I'll be very happy with the credit. And a very famous band used it. There is an article in a famous music magazine where they quoted using it. They said, we used one of Steve Levine's samples on this track, and it was the inspiration for the track.
Yeah.
And they credited me. And because they credited me, there's a tiny, like a whisker of, it's like £1 every year. But I still get, that's how...
That needs to happen.
That's how it should happen on AI, that if someone is harvesting data, there's a full provenance as to where it came from. On the other hand, if an artist, and this is, I know, happening in the film industry, if an artist is getting towards the end of their career and their voice is changing and they wish to re-record or to have a new set of recordings using the sound that they once had, and they're able to analyze their own voice techniques, absolutely, with their consent. Don't have a problem with that at all. And if for some reason you wish to, for example, and I have done this, working with May, for example, we created some really lovely kind of R sounds, background oohs and ahs, there's this great plugin which can take the original vocal, so her original vocal,
Yes.
and analyze it and can create the third above or the octave above.
And economically, that's a lot cheaper than bringing in...
No, it was not.
No.
In this case, it was sonically, because
Right.
she's capable of doing it.
Yes.
But what we discovered, it was really interesting. She did multi-layer it herself, but it sounded too much of the same sound.
Right.
So by using the plugin, we were able to create...
It's a variation.
yes.
Yeah.
And so that was a production
Yeah.
decision. It wasn't a... It's
So
actually not cheaper. It takes quite a long time,
Right,
actually.
yeah.
But it was a sonic
Yeah.
decision.
So the engineer in you can see, possibilities like you could see with the Lindrum.
Yes.
With AI, which makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
And I think that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah. So it's very positive when it has benefits, as we all will
Yes.
find benefits. But I saw a brilliant quote in a magazine a couple of days ago where an artist was saying, I want AI to do my laundry and washing so I can concentrate on my art.
Yes.
I don't want it to be the other way around.
Yes, quite right. Yeah. Well, I think we'll watch with interest. There's been some pieces in the music trades over the last few weeks about a company called 11 Labs, who have done deals with Merlin, who we're a member of, and now Cobalt, publishing company. And so we'll see, and I'm not an authority on what those deals are going to manifest, but one hopes that in doing deals with music companies and creating a relationship, they can foster remuneration if and when they
well, there
train
has
on
to
the
be,
data.
because, for example, those that make a living out of library music, and for those that don't know, library music
Yes.
is often used in say these documentaries where they just need a bed of something underneath, but they don't have the budget to have commercial music, or indeed in many cases they don't want commercial music because it's distracting from the narrative of what's in the program. I've done library music myself for that very reason.
Yes.
The brief has been, if we use a commercial track, the ear is drawn to the commercial track and you don't hear the narrative.
Yeah.
Those are the type of tracks that are at risk.
Yeah.
And that's a whole industry that could be the Nottingham lace industry. Suddenly no
Gone.
one wants
Yeah,
Nottingham
yeah.
lace anymore.
Well, and so the other point I was going to ask you briefly about, and then we're probably coming to the end of time, is we're experiencing, and you're seeing again in the news, both music trade and more broadly culture news, that there are seemingly an increasing number of artists choosing to remove their catalogues from streaming platforms.
Yes.
And I think if we come from that production library point, one of the points that's been made about one of the large streaming platforms, and I'll choose not to name any at this point, but is that they have harvested a lot of their own background music, which is diluting the royalties from original artists. And people have a number of issues with different DSPs and platforms, and reasons why either morally or economically they may choose to remove themselves from these platforms. But as someone who is focused on the kind of the commercial business
Yes, I
of
agree.
recording,
It's basic greed. I mean, they have a model which works well. I'm still amazed that the major record companies allowed this to ever happen, because, back in the day when we had MTV essentially got all those videos for nothing, and people said it's never going to happen again, but it has. So,
but it has created a huge amount of revenue for artists.
a few people and a lot of nothing from the majority. That's the
Yes.
problem. The money is there. It's just not being distributed. There's two parts with streaming. You're absolutely right. There's the cutting up of the cake. And even if you cut the cake up, I think it's outrageous that these companies are essentially creating their own music to dilute
Yes.
the cutting of the cake. That's the same way. I'll do an edit in case you don't want to use this. It's the same way that broadcasters who have a blanket license with PRS in the UK, for example, who then put their own music in it to dilute the blanket license.
Yes.
That's outrageous, because those that do it professionally, because my argument is, well, then let me have a cut of your film. But
Yes.
they won't do that. So whether you use that or not, that's maybe too contentious. But the point is that that's diluting the fund, the
Yes.
pot, and that is wrong.
Yeah.
Just as they very recently, one particular streaming company brought out bundling to include books to reduce again the amount they're paying. It's like greedy.
Yes.
You've got a fantastic model. Pay what's fair. Be fair. otherwise. And you know yourself, if a band makes 300 CDs or 300 vinyl records and sells those, they will make more money than millions of streams. That's what's so wrong. And then the final thing with streaming, of course, is if a track is played on the radio, all the people that are involved in the creating of that track, the musicians, producers, etc., get equitable remuneration.
Yes.
And that does not exist on streaming. So session musicians can play on a track that's had 1 billion streams and not get a single penny. And that is absolutely outrageous.
And for you, being, I assume, a session musician or having those kind of credits on many recordings, have you felt that?
Absolutely.
Or rather not felt that income stream?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a big part of a producer or a session musician's income. So if a track is played on the radio in the UK, because not every country in the world does pay it correctly.
No.
America shamelessly does not.
Yeah. Well, and the collection systems are still lacking.
But it works quite well in the UK. If you're a British citizen,
it does.
And the recordings have been made in the UK, PPL represents your essential rights in sound recordings, what's called neighbouring rights, and it works quite well.
Yeah.
But that's disappearing as streaming becomes essentially the radio of the future.
Exactly.
But they're not paying radio rates.
Well, my concern, though, is if you think of it as the radio of the future and you think about discoverability and how artists may find their audiences, if they become forced or they feel that they cannot justify putting their music on these platforms, how much of a disadvantage are they creating for themselves from that perspective of getting discovered? And it's a very challenging way up.
Currently, it probably is a disadvantage.
Yes.
However, with the way the algorithms are working, they're not throwing up the tracks. So I've got stuff that's...
For some.
Well, I don't see any of mine being thrown up in algorithms.
Yeah.
And, mine are getting some radio play. So I don't think the algorithm is that good. So I think... if you're brave enough, maybe it's okay. But again, if you're lucky enough to be playing live or doing some functions, then maybe the word of mouth is actually incredibly valuable as well. If you do a gig to 300 people and all those 300 people go and buy your record, that's as good as several thousand streams.
Well, and I think one of the inspiring things about talking to you at this point, having spent so much time in the industry, is how many kind of revenue verticals, to use kind of business speak, but how many different sort of tranches of your artistry, if we can call it that, there's lots of different ways that it manifests that you've built to make a career. You're not just a record producer. You've done so many different things that overlap and cross into each other that has, built a wonderful...
But you have to do that. You have to do that from a financial point of view.
Yes.
And also, I have to do it from a creative point of view. I think I'd go mad otherwise.
Yes.
I would drive my wife mad. She knows that I have to have a studio, because what would I do all day?
But I think that's the thing to be an artist, is that we can't just look at one streaming platform and hope that that's where our income.
No.
And it's never been like that.
No.
So they're not responsible for that, but we do want equitable remuneration and a level playing field.
Yes.
And people should stay in their lanes. If you're a streaming platform, be a streaming platform. You don't need to be a music creation company as well. So,
well, then that's down to governments being very firm and saying that absolutely that. I mean, I've governments have finally said that the record companies and the publishing companies must pay a per diem and expenses for people to do songwriting sessions, because for quite a number of years that's been abused, enormously abused. So it just needs government to say to the streaming services, if you wish to have a business, these are the rules. Or don't do it. And they will definitely find a way of making it work.
Well, I think that's increasingly important in an increasingly independent industry. It's so easy now to release music and be an independent and build your own business, but there needs to be bodies that help to organise the
Absolutely.
industry.
And in the case of the UK is somewhat unique in the world, in as much as it's a very, very big revenue earner for the government and the exchequer. And it punches above its weight in terms of brand UK. And so governments should respect it more than they do. I think we're getting there slightly. And as I said, this first thing is a first good positive step, but we need more. We need proper legislation to that. We need proper accountability of contracts and things like that, so that legacy contracts can be readjusted,
updated,
because they're not fit for purpose today. They weren't fit for purpose then, but they're less fit for purpose today. But a government can just say, these are the rules. They said you can't smoke in pubs. Everyone went mad, but now you can't smoke
No, you can't.
in a pub.
And we're all healthier for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they just need to say, you've got to pay equitable remuneration or don't do business in this country.
Yeah.
And then they'll work a way around it.
Yeah.
You know, it's always until things, break,
Yeah.
and then so that's it. They should say about AI, I'm very concerned about the government's
Yes.
view, and the same with America. I think they seem to be pandering to huge amounts of lobbying.
Yes.
And they don't understand the ramifications of it. And once that genie's out of the bottle, it's very hard to put back in.
Indeed. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you so much for talking to us. Really appreciate it, and very inspirational to kind of hear some of your stories. So yeah, 50 years and still going strong.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.